The medium tier is a bit more under pressure. This is something that we've seen very heavily, honestly, in luxury, and which for me, in a way, has also led to seeing the rise of quiet luxury. I know we talk a lot about quiet luxury for a couple of years, 3 years maybe, but this is for me a bit the resultant of what happened in terms of consumer polarization. Because also higher net worth individual, higher spending consumers don't want to be associated maybe too much with a younger population and that are buying more iconic pieces and that are turning maybe towards less logo branded items, toward less iconic items. So this is for me really the key item I would take out of the study is more the polarization of the consumer in a way.
Camille, welcome to the show. It's a real pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, Emilia, and very nice to see you. Very happy to be with you today as well.
Simon-Kucher has just released new global research exploring how luxury consumers are evolving, which we're all very excited about. And it covers different markets, different categories, stages of growth. So I thought maybe to start us off, what was the ambition behind this research and what are the key consumer questions that you were trying to answer with this report?
Quite simply, we've seen very, very important growth post-COVID era into the luxury market. So the objective was more to understand why we are actually living and seeing a slowdown in 2024, 2025. 2025 was a very flat year for luxury, depending on categories, of course. But that was a bit the starting point, really with three main aims. The first one being really to understand what were the consumer dynamics. So what were we projecting in terms of growth across different consumer segments? What were they projecting in terms of spending intentions? Typically, were they planning on spending more, spending less? How would they actually do their spendings? A second one was more to understand differences across markets, across regions, because obviously growth is very, very different across the US, across Europe, across China, across India. We'll come back to those geographies specifically. But we wanted to touch upon really what was going on and what was the underlying base of growth into those different geographies. And third objective was more understanding dynamics per category. We've seen some categories being much more resilient than others, watches being one of them. We'll come back to that. But definitely I wanted to understand what were also the projection when it came to categories. What were also potential growing categories versus the one that really suffered from heavy price increases in the past, typically. So that was a bit the starting point. In the end, the objective being quite simple, being able to advise some of our clients and some of the key luxury players on where can we anticipate and find growth pocket over the next 5 to 6 years, basically. That was a bit the starting point.
That's really helpful. Thank you. And to ground that for our audience, could you just maybe briefly explain the data that's sitting behind the study, be it the consumer or the market data?
So we used multiple sources of data. I think the first one that we really spent a lot of time on was having our own proprietary consumer market. So there what we did is really a consumer study across more than 1,000 consumer across the globe, in the US, in Europe, in China, in India in this case. Plus we also use some global market data that is available, typically from Euromonitor, Statista, so really public sources with the objective to say we want to understand what happened thanks to global data, but we also want to understand what we can project in terms of consumer sentiment, consumer perception over the future thanks to our own consumer study. On top of that, of course, coupled with our consultant experience, but those were really the two key pieces of data we actually base ourselves on.
That's the exciting part, and I'm hoping we really get to pick your brain in this episode today, so thank you. When you look across the findings, what do you see really as sort of the biggest, most important shifts in the luxury consumer behaviour as we move towards 2026?
If I had to choose really the one key insight that comes out of the study, it would be for me polarization of the consumer. What we see is that we do have a big part of consumers that are trading up, moving to higher baskets, to moving to higher, more prestigious brands. So really trying to trade up and increase in a way their spending. That's a small part of the population and of the consumer base. The other element that's for me key is then the lower part of that funnel, which would be then more aspirational consumers, younger consumers that are really buying some trendy or iconic pieces, but that don't have such a huge basket or such a huge purchasing power when it comes to luxury. This is for me really the two key pieces, which means also that the medium tier is a bit more under pressure. This is something that we've seen very heavily, honestly, in luxury, and which for me, in a way, has also led to seeing the rise of quiet luxury. I know we talk a lot about quiet luxury for a couple of years, 3 years maybe, but this is for me a bit the resultant of what happened in terms of consumer polarization. Because also higher net worth individual, higher spending consumers don't want to be associated maybe too much with a younger population and that are buying more iconic pieces and that are turning maybe towards less logo branded items, toward less iconic items. So this is for me really the key item I would take out of the study is more the polarization of the consumer in a way.
It's really interesting. And from a brand perspective, if you had to pick what will most change how luxury brands grow over the next, say, 18 to 24 months, what would you say that was and why?
I guess the key point I would be mindful of is if I was today to work for a luxury brand is how do you choose the consumer segment that you're actually targeting? I think post-COVID era, we have seen high demand, very fast growth across all categories. So all brands were really trying to capitalize on that and leverage the growth that we saw across the different categories. I think today, because we also see kind of an overflow of luxury across all kind of population, all kind of categories of age, there is also for me the challenge for the key brands to recenter themselves on who are their key consumer targets, who do they want to appeal to, and kind of redefine really the one key consumer target to avoid losing themselves in a way on too many different consumer targets, consumer segments. This will be for me a key challenge. That's something we've seen actually with many also smaller brands that have been exploding after the COVID and that had to question themselves, okay, who are my true competitors and who am I actually trying to seduce with my offer? So for me, it's very much about recentering your offer, recentering your strategy around core consumer segments if we want to make sure that we don't lose them and don't divert into too many directions, actually.
Going back to the shopper profiles, your study identified 7 distinct luxury shopper profiles, which I found really interesting. You had the power patron, the status shopper. If you had to pick, let's say, 2 or 3 of these profiles, in terms of which ones matter the most right now with the growth that we are seeing, which ones would they be and what distinguishes them in terms of behavior or, expectations?
I think you've mentioned actually 2 of the most important one. Definitely power patrons are for me one of the key consumer profiles we need to be mindful of. They are especially present in China. For me, those are really the key consumers that have relatively low price sensitivity, that are ready to pay relatively high baskets and be really on iconic brands. Those are really for me the consumer that are very, very present in China. On the other side, you have exactly the status shopper that you do have mentioned, Emilia, which are for me consumers that are maybe a bit less loyal to one brand. They will be able to shop across the multi-brand platforms, typically looking really for key iconic pieces that they can display to show a sort of social status, social situation. Those consumers typically are very much present in India, where we do see a lower consumer loyalty today. And the third one that would be key for me is probably the quiet luxury ones. As its name says, is basically the consumer that are looking for less logo branded items, maybe less iconic, less pieces that are known to the public and really looking for craftsmanship and detail of quality, which is for me very much present into more mature markets, typically Europe or the US.
And you mentioned China there, and I found that really fascinating. You mentioned, China still dominates in purchase frequency. I think it was something like over 40% of consumers were identifying as fashion-forward icons. What's your read on China right now? How should brands read China right now? Is it still a growth engine, or should they be trying to, maintain some kind of market share?
I think China will remain a growth engine. I mean, given the size of the population and then also still the growth rate that we predict for that region, I don't think this is a region you can easily abandon, of course. For me, what we've seen really into the past years is fast growth with lots of opening doors, lots of retail openings, really trying to capitalize on the frenetic growth, if you want, in a sense, for China. I think the question that we see today, because Chinese consumers are also turning in a way to more quiet luxury to a lower extent than what we see in mature markets, but it will be more about making sure that we go back to quality, still a level of craftsmanship that they are looking for, and they are more and more prone to really buying qualitative items, less turned toward iconic brand like they used to be. So it's more for me a question of emphasizing the quality that you have within your offer, returning to a core offer, without necessarily focusing so much on opening doors as it was in the past. So it's still about quality and growing the consumer base that you already have built into the Chinese market, without necessarily going into expansion in terms of retail or in terms of network, because it's already quite well established now in China.
Agree. And I want to talk about India a little bit as well, but I'm going to park that for a second. If we zoom out for a moment, just looking at the overall categories and markets before we dive into specifics, what do you think is the overall picture emerging, across luxury categories and markets right now? I guess what I'm asking is, where are you seeing momentum and where are you seeing more pressure or perhaps slowdown? And you mentioned a little bit there as well.
If I take a more global point of view on the categories performance, I think watches, jewelry, and then more experiential luxury is not doing too bad. Honestly, those are definitely the three categories that have been still seeing some growth in 2024, 2025. Also, because typically if I take the watches, this is really a category where consumer actually do perceive a very strong craftsmanship, very strong quality, very strong work behind actually the product development. When it comes to ready to wear, for me, this is a bit the other side of the coin, where we do have seen heavy pressure in terms of volumes, heavy pressure in terms of growth, and then in terms of value, mostly due to very heavy price increases that have been passing over the last few years. What consumers tell us is that really today we see that ready to wear has increased prices very, very heavily, but quality has not necessarily followed through. So it's more a question of perception and value for money, which has definitely decreased much faster on ready to wear than it has on watches typically. Although watches are challenged as well a bit, especially end of 25. But that would be for me a bit the read in terms of category dynamics, category perspectives.
And I think from a consumer perspective, if we can take a look at that from the consumer lens, and I know you're going to say, I don't have a magic answer, but, what's really driving these differences? Are they about shifts in consumer psychology? Are they about perceptions of value? And I know your company does a lot of work on that, willingness to pay, or is it something else? What's driving it from the consumer's perspective?
I think definitely the element around value for money for me is key. We've seen that typically, I think it was in the US, that around 30 to 40% told us they actually saw a decrease in value for money over the last 2 years, which is for me very strong typically in the US, in a more mature market in Europe as well. This is definitely for me what's driving perception of those consumers in terms of category dynamics typically. I think India is very different in that point, and I know we'll talk again about India just in a minute, but Indian consumer for me are much younger in terms of when they have started to purchase luxury. This is something that's growing much, much, much faster. So they do still have that innocence in a way when they start buying luxury, that they are less educated about what should be the right value for money. And I'm not saying this in a negative way. It's more that they are perceiving this as they have now access to luxury items, which probably have had less in the past. So this is more about really local and regional dynamics, I would say, rather than a global consumer in terms of luxury. So not one unique answer depending on which geography you're actually looking at. Definitely Indian are less sensitive to price today, where typically a more mature market would be more price sensitive and more mindful about what value do we actually deliver behind the price tag that we actually need to pay when it comes to luxury items.
And it's probably, stating the obvious, but, what I'm hearing you say, it's really value driven. It's really about that perception of value, and it's really about the psychology relating to that economic condition, I guess. It's not necessarily cultural or something that's happening outside of that. Okay. So having said what you've said, this is where I'm going to really take advantage of having Simon-Kucher on the call. So if you were advising a brand leadership team today, based on what you've just told me, what would be the one strategic decision this insight should directly influence?
It's a good question, because taking out one key item will be tough. I guess I would take 3 if I can. The first one would be sure about who you are actually targeting. This means really having a clear understanding of who are your consumers, what kind of other brands, other competitors are they actually purchasing today. That's really, for me, kind of the basis. And I think most of the bigger names when it comes to luxury are clear on that. I'm more talking about emerging luxury brands, fast growing luxury brands. We have actually accompanied and supported a lot in the post-COVID era. For me, this would be really the one key advice. The second one would be clear about who are the consumers that are funding your margin and who are the consumers that are funding your growth. Obviously, you want to have different mechanics, different categories, different assortment also behind those two dynamics. And the last one would be clear about what are the consumers that you need to provide with an entry range. What are the consumers you want to seduce tomorrow? Not exactly the same as the growth consumer, because for me, those are really the ones you want to bet for the future that might not be a big part of your consumer base today, but that will most likely definitely be a very big part of your journey and of the growth you have to bet on for the next 10, 20, 30 years.
I think it's really important to put the practical application to what the insights are saying. So thanks for taking the time to explain that. So let's take a moment to talk about India. Everybody is talking about India right now. You know, it's one of the fastest growing luxury markets globally, 5.9% CAGR, outpacing the luxury category overall. We've got really strong data in your report as well, stating that 84% of consumers plan to increase their spending in the next 12 months, which is really exciting. They also tend to spend on the higher end, as China does as well. So if I was a luxury brand, how do you think I should be sequencing my approach to India right now in terms of, you know, categories, positioning, and the consumer segments?
I think in terms of categories, it will be hard to give you one answer. For me, it's more in terms of what are the assortment, what are the part of your collection, of your assortment that you want to push to India. We know that Indian consumers today are very much attracted to iconic product, iconic brands. They are not loyal to one brand, and they will really pick and choose within a set of 5, 10, 15 brands, the key items they want to look for to make sure it shows something about their social status. This is still something that needs to be displayed in public, showing some sort of level of wealth in a way into the Indian market. So for me, it's more about what kind of assortment do you need to push to the Indian market. Ready to wear typically might not be the first category I would go for, because those are usually items that are a bit more comparable, that are a bit less associated to one unique brand. So the first category I would potentially focus on is rather leather goods, small leather goods, where you do have very iconic pieces. This is usually one of the key categories where luxury players are actually recognized for into the different markets, not only for India, but then definitely going into India with that category would make sense. So it's more about making sure that you provide the Indian market with items that are visible and that do say, I bought this item at this brand, or this one. It's really more about the name and iconic visible pieces, visible styles. It's not so much either today about having a large retail landscape, having a large retail network. We know that many Indian shoppers actually buy online, which means also that it saves a bit of time in terms of capex and how much do we actually want to invest into the retail network. But yeah, that would be a bit for me my 2 cents. So really in terms of category, be on the visible items, iconic items, and capitalize on the growth that we see online to avoid big capex in the short term in India.
And you noted that the Indian consumers are often, you know, exploring luxury brands through multi-brand platforms, and that they have lower brand attachment, meaning essentially they're less loyal. How does one actually build loyalty in India?
I think it's definitely a longer-term objective, longer-term strategy. I think the Indian market is opening now to luxury over the past 2-3 years. So it's more about making sure that they get to enjoy also that market. So I think short-term, honestly, it's not so much something I would focus on. It's more making sure that we also build momentum, build on the fact that the Indian consumer are ready to buy our iconic pieces. For me, it's more than a question of segmenting also your consumer base and understanding what is the lifetime value of your Indian consumer. Making sure that you identify what is the category they actually penetrate your assortment with. Is it leather good? Is it ready to wear? Typically, consumer that penetrate through ready to wear, those are the consumers that you might expect to be a bit more loyal over time. That's something we've seen a lot into data, not specifically in this study, but also in past studies, that ready to wear is a category that's a bit more understated, that consumer will actually be more mindful, more knowledgeable about what they actually buy. So I would look very carefully at what categories, what kind of pieces and items do they buy as a first-time buyer, to make sure we build on different strategies, different perception and different direction for the consumer. So I don't know yet, honestly, how we will build loyalty for Indian consumers specifically, but definitely having a clean read at your data, having very quickly a clean CRM for me is key, because you will activate them very differently depending on what category, what items they actually enter your assortment with.
Okay, and I think sort of packaging all of it up when you talk about making sure you know your consumer, making sure that you know you've got specific strategies for everybody. If I was to ask you from a very practical perspective, just to close out on the questions on India. So if a brand was considering entering India, in your opinion, I guess what would be the first diagnostic step, you'd recommend to assess whether there really is, and you mentioned some of it there about which category you're operating in, whether there is a real opportunity for their category or positioning before any major investments are made?
On that, typically what I would do is leverage the online data you might have. I mean, most of the brands that are today already in India did start actually together with CRM data, did start with online sales actually. So I would capitalize on that data. Most of the brands actually have that. Even if you haven't had any focus on India over the last few years, this will already give you quite a good read through. I would have a look very specifically at what are the categories, but then the subcategories and the key items that you are actually being able to sell into the Indian market. And then a bit similar to what I just mentioned before, it's about structuring your assortment to make sure that you're not overflooding the Indian market with your full range of assortment, but focusing on some specific subcategories, key seasonal or permanent item as well, but that need to be visible and say something about the Indian consumer that is buying the product. So it's very much for me the first step, identifying the right assortment before anything else. You've said it. We've seen that the Indian consumer are much less price sensitive than others, even less sensitive than Chinese consumers typically. So I would focus more really on key items, not taking into account too much yet if we have a clean architecture, a clean range in terms of price positioning, because we know it's less of a topic today in India. So yeah, that would be my first step if I had to launch in India.
And you mentioned the CRM aspect. So could you just go into a little bit more detail there about if the brand already has CRM data? You mentioned even if it's not from within India, what are they looking for in the data then if it's not from India, in the CRM data they already own?
Yeah, so this is something we very often exploit because your CRM data is usually a mine of gold. Typically, what I would look at, because you usually have very, very detailed data when it comes to consumer, where they are living, where they are purchasing. So we can very often also do link between the country of origin versus the country of purchase. So I think this is for me the first key step. Typically, when we look at purchase in the UK, we know that many people from the Middle East are buying in the UK. So I would look really at dependencies between two markets, understand Indian today, where are they shopping? Are they shopping in France? Are they shopping in the UK? Are they shopping, in the US? To make sure we understand where they are buying, where we need to have also some sort of mirroring in terms of strategies. If the Indian consumers are actually today buying in the UK, we'll also have a look very closely at what are the iconic styles that we have into the UK per category, to make sure we kind of apply a similar assortment, a similar mirroring strategy, if I can say it like that, because that's usually something we do very closely by, even when it comes to pricing strategy. We know, I mentioned it, that in the Middle East, they buy a lot in the UK. So we'll make sure we also have some sort of consistency corridor in terms of price positioning versus the home market, if I can position it like that. I would really use that data, because even if you don't have yet a footprint in India, you do have Indian consumer, that's for sure. And we can identify them easily into the CRM and then understand where they buy, what they buy. That impacts the category and the assortment they should have in India.
I want to go deeper on CRM as a whole, not just across India. In your opinion, and I know we've spoken about CRM before and you've done a lot of work with companies and you've just said there's a gold mine of data. How should luxury brands rethink the way they communicate and build relationships with consumers, particularly through CRM and their own channels?
That's a good question. And that's one of the topics we did investigate in our latest study. I think today consumers, not specifically luxury, but consumers are flooded by consumer CRM communication. I think specifically in the luxury industry, I think honestly, a very, very vast majority of the consumers today are targeted through CRM communication. I think in the population that we did interview, it was around 80-90% of them that actually were targeted through CRM. However, what was surprising, and specifically in the US, I think it's only around 40% of the consumer only are satisfied with what they are actually getting in terms of CRM communication. And on the other side, we also ask them, are you dissatisfied? And again, 40% of them are dissatisfied. So you have kind of a big polarized market again when it comes to satisfaction around CRM. 40% of your consumer base that's not happy with the communication they are getting. It's a lot. That's especially important in the US, especially important in Europe as well, in more mature markets where they do pay more attention. I think typically we were talking about Indian consumer. They are much less dissatisfied than what we see in Western countries. So for me, it's about three things again, making sure that you do push the right timing with the right frequency. What we hear very, very often is that, okay, I'm receiving CRM communication from many brands every day, every 2 days. That's too much today. And I think especially in luxury where we want to have that special link connection together with the consumer, it's very important that we are clear on timings and frequency around that. The second element is also around the personalization. Honestly, what we hear, and especially for luxury, is that consumers are expecting to receive special personalized offer, personalized invitation to some events, etc., which today is not necessarily the case. They feel like they are being mass mailed like any other consumer. So there is really a lot to be done around that, I think, honestly, in terms of personalization. And the last item, which we've heard a lot specifically for luxury, is that they would enjoy also to have that more human touch in a way, typically through rather a phone call. I know many luxury brands are also implementing that, of course, to make sure they keep a very human and specific connection together with the consumer. So that would be for me a third item to really investigate. How can we reintegrate some human touch, human discussion that's going much further than just mass mailing or even personalized mailing, but through personal interaction over the phone, per text. So it shouldn't stop really at the mass mailing communication in a way. I think this is really for me the 3 cents I would take out of the CRM questions that we've actually been interviewing. And that's a key element because today consumers just get sick of getting new CRM communication. Luxury brands invest much more money than any other sectors into communication towards consumer. So we need to make sure this is much sharper than it used to be.
And if you had to tell, I think the lowest scores were, as you were saying, in the US and Europe in terms of dissatisfaction with the CRM tactics. If you had to tell companies in the US or Europe one thing to fix, what would it be?
Personalization for sure. I think there are so many ways to do that today through AI, through different agents that you can also integrate into reading your CRM data. One of the big flaws or big weakness that we always see when it comes to addressing your consumer base is how do you use the CRM data that you have. Many companies in luxury invest in heavy CRM database that they don't actually use to the fullest. For me, there is really a key challenge in making sure that all that data is actually factored into your CRM and media strategy and campaign strategy. That would be for me the key step. Do use the CRM data that you have to actually segment the activities and the communication that you're doing with your consumers.
Excellent. That makes a lot of sense. You mentioned it there. You talked about, this is a heavy investment. So we're usually talking about really large corporations and heritage maisons, scaling big brands. Let's flip it around a little bit here because you also work with smaller and emerging brands. How do you believe that the insights from your report could help smaller or, say, emerging luxury brands?
We've supported many small emerging brands, especially post-COVID when the growth was really tremendous. For me, the key element they need to take out of that study is be clear on who you are targeting. Typically, I have a couple of brands in mind I've worked with over the past 2 years. Their key question was, who is my competitive environment? Am I competing against the big brand names of this world? Am I actually competing rather towards premium plus smaller luxury boutiques? So the first thing we did together with those brands was really doing a consumer study to understand who your consumers are buying from other than you, to have a clear view and a clear understanding of your positioning versus competition. typically a couple of brands that I have in mind thought they were actually competing against the Chanel, the Dior, Hermes of this world, when they were rather competing against much, much smaller brands, emerging brands in terms of luxury, which did have a huge impact on the way they were actually transmitting the value to their consumer. Obviously, you're not positioning yourself the same in terms of price if you're competing against a Chanel versus a more entry luxury brand. So there for me, it's really about when you are growing so fast, when you're a smaller brand that are not yet structured as any other big brand would be sure of where you want to be tomorrow. And that should impact, therefore, the assortment you will have behind that, the positioning in terms of prices, and the types of communication that you want to have, the type of media animation also that you want to have. But for me, this is really the key first step if you want to make sure you grow into the right direction and tap onto the right consumer segment. Otherwise, you're just dispersing yourself around many, many different consumer segments that are maybe not ready to buy actually your assortment and your brand. So that would be for me really the first key step. If you're going fast, you're a smaller brand on the rather mid-tier or lower tier of luxury. That's for me really the key priority.
So segmentation first.
Yeah. Segmentation. And good point, because a second item I wanted to mention is invest quickly into a CRM. I mean, it doesn't need to be the most advanced CRM, but several brands I've worked with did not actually have any CRM data, which makes it very hard also to segment your consumer, understand who is buying from what, through which categories do they actually enter your portfolio. So do invest in CRM, even if it's something quite simple. But the earliest you get those insights, the fastest you will be able also to tailor your assortment, tailor your positioning to the right consumers you're actually targeting.
And would your answer be the same if they're very low on resource? Let's assume this emerging brand is really budget strapped. Would you still say you must start with the segmentation?
Yes, I think I would, because honestly, if you're not clear on who you are going after, who your assortment is targeting and aim for, what's the point? And how do you know actually how you will be developing tomorrow? Potentially, if you have really no resources, I wouldn't say invest already into a CRM. Let's do with what you have today. And that might be a bit more manual work, a bit more bricolage, as we say in French. Definitely starting from the consumer will always be for me the first step, because that's where you understand who your brand should be, who you are targeting, what kind of positioning you need to have, what kind of categories you need to focus on. And that flows down even down to your production and the creative part also of the maison and of the luxury brand. Because if you're not clear, honestly, you can go into 15 million different directions. Now, when it comes to data, I know this is kind of a luxury also to be able to pay to get good data. So that might not be the priority if you don't actually have the money to invest into a CRM, but be clear about who you want to target, even if it's more sitting together with a different leader from the company and of the different maison, even from a creative perspective. But I would really start from that. Yeah.
Okay, so I love where you're going with this. I'm going to take you into the next step, and that's decision making. So you advise some of the world's most sophisticated luxury brands, and we know that data sits at the heart of that work, particularly when it comes to how these businesses make decisions. So from a practical standpoint, because, we always like to give practical advice on the podcast, what are the most important consumer signals that luxury brands should be tracking today? And not from the sense of more data, but which data do you believe actually leads to better decisions? Because ultimately we're all in the business to grow.
Yeah, for me, there are two types of KPI or attributes you would actually need to look at. The first one, really from a product perspective, I think a very important one is your mix across categories, mix across geographies. Why do I say that? It's a rather simple KPI, but understanding really what kind of product you're selling where, and at which price. Understanding, do I rather have a high basket on ready to wear in China, low basket on jewelry in the US, just inventing categories. But I would really look at that, because it will also orientate and dictate what kind of assortment, what kind of direction you need to take when it comes to assortment allocation. Typically, giving you a random example, in China, we would see that on watches, consumers are looking for leather bracelet. Then we would also potentially orientate and allocate our assortment a bit differently between China and then the US, where they are looking for silver bracelet. So for me, there is really a question around your product mix, which is a key indicator to look at in the first step. The second one would be definitely value or willingness to pay. Understanding also the that would go typically through the average basket and the frequency of purchase. We know in luxury, depending on the category, frequency is not necessarily so high. But I would really look at the evolution of those KPIs because it gives you quite a good read on consumer intention, consumer perception of the value for money, although it's not the unique KPI, but it's really a powerful one. So I would look at that. And then finally, the third KPI I would look at to make the right decision is more the consumer mix within your portfolio. So similar to the product mix, but then on the consumer side, to understand who is buying from you and how is that changing. Are we actually now targeting an older population, a younger population that is from a specific geography or from another one? So rather to understand how it's evolving and how do we tap into that? Is it something that we want to do voluntarily, or is it rather the result of evolution or a macroeconomic situation? So I would really look at those three KPIs because it will give you some very good insights on how you allocate your assortment, but also what kind of positioning and price you can expect behind that strategy.
And you mentioned the consumer there. If you had to strip this back to just 3 questions every luxury brand should be able to answer about their consumer, what would that be?
So first one is, who are the consumers that are actually fueling my margins, similar to what we were discussing before, and where I can actually optimize in terms of premiumization, where there is potentially lower price sensitivity. Second one would be, who are the consumers that are then fueling my growth and where I might agree to actually invest a bit more, be a bit less profitable. And then the last one, similar to everything we've discussed, is who are the consumer or the segment that are actually over-investing versus the value that they are ready to spend. To also make sure that we step back from that kind of consumer unless we do see a very strong growth bet into the future. But similar to what we were discussing, into making sure that we keep focused on the right consumer segment, we also need to make sure where we don't want to go to avoid destroying value, but also capitalizing on where growth actually lies tomorrow.
I find that fascinating because if you are sitting in a brand decision-making room or a brand meeting, that is not what they're talking about normally. So where do you most often see brands over-investing in data without actually improving the decision-making? Where are they wasting money on data?
I guess where I do see a lot of companies investing a lot with no clear results today, but it will come, I'm sure, in the future, is also into AI or more automatic analytics agents or dashboards. I think we talk a lot about AI. We haven't talked so much about it today, but you do hear a lot when you talk to a company you haven't talked to before that they do want to invest a lot into AI and that AI is a key priority for them, but without a clear understanding of what does that actually mean for them. And very often what we try to do specifically for luxury player is understanding how AI is actually supporting the growth of your business objective and the achievement of your business objective. So today I do see quite a lot of investment going into that direction without a clear business strategy or business objective behind that. I think for me, that would be one of the key area where we need to optimize on the spendings, because there are thousands of tools and solutions out there that you can invest in. Do spend some time before investing into understanding what you expect that AI component, AI agents to be able to do for you. And that starts from the business. That doesn't start from the tech part. This is for me really a loss today that we have potentially into AI tools. Yeah.
So as I mentioned earlier, we are very privileged to have access to you today because normally this kind of thinking only happens inside consulting projects. And we have worked on some of those together before. They tend to be laborious and, really big in scale. So I want to close this out with everything we've talked about. So if we're looking at everything we've discussed, the consumer shifts, the category dynamics, the markets, emerging markets like India, how brands communicate, CRM, how they use data. If we put a growth lens on it, because this is what you do, and this is, I think, what's really unique about your consultancy doing both the research and the strategic work. So if we put a growth lens on it, the way you would inside a client project, where should luxury brands focus right now? And what's the one action you think that everybody should be doing?
Tough question, because if I had to choose really one geography or one category, it would be hard to tell you which one. I think definitely China remains a key growth engine. We've mentioned it. For me, it's more a question on how do we regain confidence? How do we make sure that we leverage really the key value that the Chinese consumer are ready to pay today without going too much into expansion mode, as we've mentioned just before? This would be for me one of the key area. Do not abandon, obviously, the key growth market or the key mature markets together with the Western world, so the US and Europe. But do invest into fast-growing markets such as India. There are other regions and other countries into APAC which are really key and dynamic in terms of growth. That would be for me the one key element to be clear on. What do you want to do locally in terms of objective? What are your ambitions per category and per region? Where today you see many companies going a bit everywhere without a clear strategy. So be clear on the strategy you have locally and where you want to penetrate, where you want to rather milk the geography. And then in terms of category, I think, again, not one specific category to keep in mind, but rather be sure of what are your next iconic moves, what are your next iconic product, visible product that you want to build demand on. I think we had, again, an explosion right after the COVID, but today there is a bit of question of what is your next best product or what is your next iconic product. So focus on that as well. That also has a creative part to it. And obviously, we need also the studios, etc., to support on that. But be sure to develop iconic product that will make your brand last and that will also make you relevant in more emerging markets where they are looking for those social status, those social shoppers.
Amazing. And is it fair to say, from what I understood from the study, the traditional anchors of luxury, social status, the fact that it's iconic, that tends to remain still in the East, which is more emerging, and the more mature luxury markets are shifting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why emerging markets are definitely markets in which you can test the launch also of new part of your assortment, new rather iconic product. Those are the parts of the world where you can definitely develop an assortment that will become tomorrow iconic. When definitely into the Western world, we are more around making sure that we still consume luxury, that luxury remains part of the key drivers for the consumers we had in the past into our consumer base. But that will go through rather solid craftsmanship, very qualitative items that are a bit less visible. So there's a key challenge around how do we differentiate also the assortment between the different regions of the world.
That makes sense. We're coming to the end and we like to ask everybody sort of mentor style questions for emerging luxury professionals. So I want to start by asking you, if we look at your own career and what you see, as well as what you see every day working closely with luxury brands, what would be your first piece of advice for emerging luxury professionals, particularly in marketing or commercial roles, who want to become more strategic in how they use data and insight?
I think, honestly, many luxury brands have tons of data that they don't use. I think if you work today in luxury, you work with a lot of data, is first have a business ambition, business criteria behind what you want to do with data. Honestly, very often when we come in and work with luxury players that have tons of data, they use it 5-10% of it. So for me, it's more, what do you want to do with the data? Do ask yourself that question and define behind that what you need in terms of data. That shouldn't be done the other way around. Typically in luxury, what we see a lot is around scrapping the data online for consumer prices from competition. Very good to have that. Now, usually companies have tons and tons of data and they don't use it. Be very mindful and clear about what you want to do with that data and what kind of strategic decision this needs to drive before actually committing to retrieving or buying such a big amount of data. That's for me really the first big piece of advice.
I love this answer. I often, in my own experience in-house, I often say start with the problem. To your point, what's the decision you're trying to make? What's the problem you're trying to solve? Because Absolutely. I feel like data is like a piece of string. I mean, you can have infinity and you still can have more. Okay, so staying on the theme of data, I love to ask this question, and you would have had this, especially working on consultancy side. So in your work as a consultant, has there ever been a moment where a specific data point helped you challenge a client's intuition or a long-held belief?
Yeah, definitely. And I think specifically working with a smaller emerging brand over the last 2 years, that's definitely where we've had potentially the most revealing insights. Typically, I was working with a client a couple of years ago. I've been supporting them for 2 years, but starting the work a couple of years ago, where we identified that the competition they actually had was really not the one that they thought they were facing. Because we did ask the consumer, who are you purchasing from? on top of that specific brand we were working with. And I think they were expecting to see rather high luxury names come up within the studies. In the end, these were rather premium plus entry luxury brands. So that had a huge impact in terms of positioning. Where can we actually see growth tomorrow? What are the consumers we should be targeting? And that's why data is so powerful. It's one truth, one vision of the truth that no one can actually refute. So yeah, that would be for me a first key step to challenge your thinking.
Did you find it very hard to land that decision, or was it very evident, very neutral, no arguments?
I mean, it's always a bit difficult to pass the message when you're actually thinking to be on the complete other side of the spectrum in a way. I think the power of data is definitely that you are in front of something that you can't really argue. I mean, it's not just a qualitative thinking that we should be competing against X or Y. So I think it was relatively well received, honestly, when it comes really fact-based. And that's why with Simon-Kucher, we work a lot with data. It's make sure that everything we take our decision on are fact-based, and that something cannot really be refuted or neglected. But definitely it's more the change management you have around the data that needs to happen, although the data is not really something you can question in a way.
And I'm going to throw in a cheeky question because this one's really hard for marketers in-house. Is there, in your opinion, a piece of advice to give our marketers who want to start using data to influence internally? Is there a tip or a trick that you could give them to help them land their message?
Yeah, I think what's important is that from day one, you do involve all the different stakeholders within your company. Data shouldn't be something that stays within CMI or within data teams, however you call them internally. Data is really a transversal topic. You need to have marketing, you have to have sales, you need to have the supply, you need to have really all the key stakeholders around you to make sure you take the right strategic decision. And that's why I was talking about one vision of the truth, because then you convey that one vision across the different functions, the different people. If you keep it to your side, there will always be challenges. There will always be questions on how you actually gather that data. So that's why very often into the different projects and missions that we do with our customers, we try to make sure we have everyone around the table. And so even if you don't work with a consultancy, make sure that you do involve all the different stakeholders so that they basically abide and accept the different findings that you have from data.
It's almost like they need to be the consultancy.
In a way, yes, absolutely.
If there is not a consultancy involved, you've got to sort of pull all the pieces together. Okay, so we've come to the end. Is there anything on our topic today that you'd like to add that we haven't covered or haven't mentioned?
No, I think we've talked a lot about the consumer. For me, the one message I want to be able to convey is really start from the consumer and deploy based on that your data strategy, assortment strategy, pricing strategy, whatever you want to go for. But definitely the consumer should be your starting point, because in the end, that's the one you need to convince with your positioning, with your offer. And if you don't have a clear view on who you are targeting and who you are talking to, you might as well go into 5 different directions. They should really be the one directing and giving you the direction for your strategy.
Consumer centricity, music to my ears. Yes, yes. And for anybody wanting to access the report that we've been drawing from today, how would they go about finding it?
I think it should be available onto our website. So I will share the link together with you, Emilia. We did 2 rounds, the first one in April last year and then the second one in October to also track evolution, but it's available on our website.
And for anybody wanting to work with Simon-Kucher in a consulting basis, any luxury brands out there, how would they go about making contact?
So they can reach out directly to me. Again, I think you have all of my contact details. I'm also on the website of Simon-Kucher, so quite easy to find me. But feel free to reach out. I mean, always happy even to have a rather informal conversation, one-to-one, just to understand the challenges. It doesn't need to be something very formal and prepared, but I'd love to have that kind of conversation with professionals from the luxury world.
Thank you so much, Camille. It's been rich and extremely insightful, and I hope the audience appreciates how exclusive the access has been to you, getting you to deliver the insight from that report directly to us. So thank you so much for your time. You've been extremely open and generous, and thanks for being here.
Thank you, Emilia, for having me. It was a pleasure to be with you today.